Let me get straight to the point. There's a new demo out, and the game has a new look. The new art style isn't completely final, but it is further in the direction that I'm aiming for. As for the demo, it's 3 levels. The first one being a bit of a tutorial, the second introducing obstacles, and the third ramping that up as well as adding some rails. Before I get into what's new, let's talk about what was broken from last time. Starting off with this image, what do you notice that's wrong? If you said the vertices aren't connected properly, you'd be correct. It's something I noticed when I tried to build corners. The geometry would sometimes have gaps in it. In the last video, I said I was thinking about rewriting the track generation code, but this aspect was something I overlooked. But once I started doing it, I realized how problematic it was. As such, I spent a bit of time laying out how I think those verts should be connected and started to plan that into a new system, which I'll get to in a minute. Related to that, the corner generation was awful. The old code made it very difficult to create corners that looked smooth and transitioned well. Basically, only the left and rightmost points would be raised, leading to some very steep and sharp slopes, which was not what I wanted it to look like. Unfortunately, due to the way I was managing vertices, it was very difficult to manipulate them. Thankfully, this problem is also fixed now, and I'll talk about it in a minute. The last remaining issue is player handling, which I'm afraid to say still has some problems, but I'll get to that later. It is, however, at least a bit different now in regards to animation and gravity. So in the last video I talked about how awful the track generation was and how I intended to redo aspects of it. Previously it was a mess of arrays and lists that were clumped together to make something. Specifically, there were 2 lists for points on the left and right sides of the track and then another list with all the points in between. That was the first thing that needed to be simplified and improved. Now there is one list that contains lists of points going from the left to the right of the track, going along the length. In other words, I use the left point as the first point and the right point as the last point, and then add additional points in between based on the horizontal resolution. But this time it's all stored in one list per line along the length, and the length itself is a list of horizontal lines. Doing it this way gives me a lot more control over the resolution of the length of the track, especially in places where I need it, like loops, twists, and so on. The horizontal resolution is now easier to manipulate, which makes creating corners less of a headache. As for the subdivision, now that I have the ability to compare each line along the length, connecting them up is less erroneous. That said, I still have to multiply or divide by 2 as I increase or decrease the horizontal resolution. This limits what the resolution can be. It can be made up of 1, 2, 4, 8, 16 or 32 segments. Not points, segments, as in the space in between points on each of the lines going horizontally. When it came to connecting them up, I set out a few different rules to look for. Does the next line and the current line have the same resolution? Does the next line have more? Does it have less? And so on. Then it was a matter of connecting them up. I went over this before in the last video, but here's a couple of diagrams I made figuring out how to connect up all the triangles. You'll notice that all the points are linked together with no gaps this time, and that they stay connected when the resolution increases or decreases. Just before moving on, I want to mention that I put a vertical offset back into the UV, so that the texture doesn't have any weirdness along the length of the track. There's a bit of wobbliness in the texture when used on corners, but adding more geometry seemed to improve it. Anyway, that covers the horizontal resolution, but what about the resolution along the length, and specifically more resolution in particular places? Well, the entire track is now broken up into sections, which I'm defining using the knot data from the spline. And for each section, I can define the resolution along the length. So some sections can have a very dense mesh, and some don't. This makes making corners and twists a hell of a lot easier. Speaking of which, I mentioned how terrible corners were in the last video, and that I wanted to figure out a better way of handling them. Initially I thought I could append additional geometry to the sides, but the colliders there would have to be changed or removed. I gave up on the idea quickly and went back to the original plan of manipulating the existing geometry. The good news is that with the rewritten track generation, it's much easier to do it. The question is, how to do it. Now with the corners, I want them to curve smoothly as well as a smooth transition from flat to raised track and vice versa. The hint is in what I just said. Curve. What tool in Unity lets you make curves? Animation curves. Initially I only made curves for side-to-side manipulation, and then tried to ease in and out of those sections in code. That ended up having a lot of errors, especially between corners of different heights. I couldn't get the easing to work properly with code, so I made another animation curve that defined the in and out transition of the curve, and that worked better, but there was still errors. So I changed it one more time, making the curve cover the entire shape of that section and setting the values to be the actual height of the corner. This worked way better, and gives me far more control over the shape of the corners. The only downside right now is that both sides of the track get raised, but I can probably fix that by providing more animation curves for various aspects. That said, if I go through with that, it may become more complicated. As it is right now, it's fairly simple and nice to use, and I think you'll agree that the results look quite nice. Moving on to player handling, and I'm disappointed to say that it's still subpar. Before I elaborate, let me talk about some of the things I have fixed or changed. Previously, I was having issues with loops, where the player would hit a vertical part of a loop, going up or down, and there would be a jitter. I was wondering why this was happening, so I paused the game at that specific point and rotated the player inside the editor to see what was up, and saw that when the X rotation was at 90 degrees, the Y and Z axis rotations essentially became the same. This is called gimbal lock, which is defined as a phenomenon that occurs when two of the three axes of a rotation of a 3D object align, resulting in the loss of 1 degree of freedom. The reason for this? Euler rotations instead of quaternion rotations. I removed the Euler code and replaced it with the quaternion counterpart, and this removed the sudden jolt completely. That said, loops still have a few issues. This seems to be related to how I'm handling gravity. Simply put, the player isn't sticking to the track properly at the apex of the loop. I mentioned I wanted to get a PID system working for the movement and rotation in the last video, and unfortunately I couldn't get it to work correctly, on any axis. I'll keep experimenting with the idea, but I might need to either do further reading on the subject, or find an alternative altogether. I've made changes to the leaning when going left or right. It no longer tears the character as much, so it's a bit more of a leaning motion instead. Considering that forward momentum is no longer player controlled and the player cannot turn around anymore, this change definitely improves the handling feel. That said, I still don't think the player feels right. There's no gravity pullback when they go up the corner slopes. There's not really any reaction when landing. The forced turning when going along the track feels bad and is probably a bit too loose. And the animations being kinda broken doesn't help at all. This is probably what I'm going to be focusing on for the next while. Now that I know what kind of tracks I can make, I have no excuse for the player feeling as bad as it does. Next up, you've probably noticed by now that the game looks different. It's not final by any means, but it's closer now to the art style I have in mind. I'm going for a minimalist, mostly monochrome look, with aspects of digital glitch art, utopianism, and of course, cyberpunk. Long term, I'll need to work on visual effects, background art, and various other things. Primarily, I want to focus on the stark contrast of colours, although I'm aware black and white are not technically colours. The sharp difference between the two makes shapes really pop, but at the same time, deep blacks can be used for silhouettes for really odd looking architecture. Art stuff is not even close to a priority at the moment, but I did want to mention why the game looks the way it does. The demo has been out for a little bit now, and I'm starting to get bits of feedback, so I'm going to list off all the various things players have had issues with. Air control was the most common issue. Multiple players complained that they wanted to be able to move the player in the air to control where they land. Originally, you hit a ramp, get air, and land wherever gravity dictates. I've already made an adjustment to the current build that adds it back in, but again, player handling needs changing, so that might get overhauled as well. Furthermore, the new trick system might get in the way, but I'll get back to that later. A frequent suggestion was adding a speed boost when you successfully land tricks. I was actually intending on adding this anyway, and there's even an aspect to the player model that I was going to use as a guide for that. If you look carefully, you'll notice that there's a white edge light to the texture on the hoverboard. My idea is to change the color of that outline when players do tricks, and if they line up to the track properly, it'll go green. If they land when it's green, they'll get the speed boost. Again, I'm probably not going to fully implement this until player handling is improved. There was also a suggestion that the FOV should be increased when in the air at speed, which sounds straightforward enough to implement. Another common complaint were the invisible walls around the track. They weren't really doing their job properly, with players often flying over them or losing all their momentum when hitting them. Plus, some players commented that they would like the ability to skip parts of the track, Rainbow Road style, which I was also thinking about. I've removed them in the current build and I'm currently testing to see how the game feels without them. A couple of players mentioned that they wanted the ability to jump off the rails while grinding. This is actually something I've been meaning to add for a while but forgot about. I'll add the ability when I get around to it. The last issue players mentioned was the fact that the underside of the track wasn't rendering. This is an issue with Unity's default materials not having double-sided rendering for flat planes. In the most recent build, I used the shader graph editor to make my own custom shader and gave it double-sided rendering, so this issue has been fixed. And that about does it for the most common bits of feedback from players. For the last bit, I want to talk about some of the ideas for the new trick system. Earlier I mentioned that the new air control mechanic might get in the way of the new trick system, and that's for one reason: controls. As it is right now, the left stick controls the player's movement and the right stick lets you rotate the player in the air. Some players mentioned that they want to rotate the yaw of the player with the left stick, while the right stick controls the pitch and roll. The simple issue with this setup is that you won't be able to have air control unless you want to spin in the direction you're going. Besides, I like the twin stick setup as is, it's simple and understandable. What I am thinking about adding is a use for the triggers. Currently the player grabs the board when in the air. This is actually a placeholder animation. With the new system, the triggers on the controller will let you grab with different hands and then perform the relevant tricks. I'm not sure if I'll use skateboard or snowboarding tricks for reference. There's a lot of crossover. I'll get to it when I get to it, I suppose. The last point is frontside and backside positions, or in skateboarding terms, regular and fakie. Currently you can only land frontside, and I don't know if I want to let players land and continue in the other direction. The big problem is that the board is currently shaped with a specific direction being the front. If you turn that around, it's going to look weird. So my question is to you, do you really want this feature or can you live without it? It'll be a lot of work to fix, but if it makes for a better game, I'll do it. Let me know in the comments. Besides Cybersurfer, what else is going on? Well, with the demo out of the way, I'm looking at catching up with some other things. Learning some new stuff in Blender, mostly related to animation. I still don't know when I can get around to learning Flax or Raylib, but it might be a while. However, the current side quest is doing some preliminary prep for 7-day FPS. As of time of recording, it hasn't technically been announced yet, but last year I spent a lot of time trying to wrap my head around VR development as well as the many issues of modeling and animating around it, and the end result was a little subpar in some areas. This time around I'm forming the basic building blocks of my idea and improving the code and systems that I wrote last time, hopefully speeding up development when the jam actually happens. I'm mostly just putting some time into figuring out basic systems around VR, improving my weapon handling, and expanding upon the original code and systems to further accommodate more weapons and scenarios. I know some folks don't like going against the spirit of the game jam crunch, but I'm a single developer and my time is often taken up with life stuff, so I tend to take some extra liberties and time around game jams so I don't completely burn myself out. With all that said, I don't entirely know whether or not it's going to be happening at all. I sure hope I'm not wasting my time, but if it does happen, you can expect another video about it in December. And that's all for this time. Like and subscribe if you want, play the demo and leave me a comment about it. I'll leave a link in the description. If you want to support me financially, there's also a link to my Ko-fi page. I'm currently thinking about adding a lot more options to make subscribing a lot more enticing. I have many assets and Blender files from the past few years, and I'm more than happy to put them on there, plus some other things I could do. Let me know if there's anything you'd like me to do to add more value for you. and you can still just send one-off donations if you prefer. Seriously, thank you to the handful of you who have given me money, I greatly appreciate it. But you know what doesn't cost you money? Subscribing here on YouTube and following me on Twitch, the latter of which is the place where I livestream a good chunk of my game dev work, among other things. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.